Welcome back. It's chapter 2 of Children of the Light by Michael Mastrella. There were some comments about the audio quality in chapter 1, so since I'm a guy with a phone, I decided to just get closer and hope that helps out with the sound. And I want to mention at the beginning here that I'm not a voice actor. The main event of this novel is the printed text version, and that would be the best version of it. And hopefully my Patreon will be made public soon and you'll be able to get the full novel there, because I certainly cannot do audio narrations of this entire book because it gets crazy and I won't be able to handle it. So let's try to get through chapter 2. The Davidsons. Quote, "Hero today, gone tomorrow," is how my mother explained it. Unquote, from Arnie Cuddebuck, Why I Did It. The back seat was a mess of blankets and bags of bottles, which was strange for such a nice car. A glance was all Dawn allowed to keep her attention on the very large driver, who met her with a bright smile. Smirk was more like it. He said, "Good evening, Mrs. Foley," and his voice was deep enough to match his size, but proper enough to go against any notions that he was just a meathead. Dawn's natural paranoia was heightened from hearing her own name. Though it was pinned to her uniform, it still gave her a start whenever a stranger would refer to her by it. You had to be a little paranoid to survive, and "he read my badge" was never her first thought. It was the second thought after, "How long has he been stalking me?" "Good evening, Mr. Davidson. Know I pulled you over?" He said, "I know exactly why you pulled me over." Dawn gave him a good 5 seconds to elaborate. After 5 seconds of staring at his smirk, she said, "Good, I'm glad we have an understanding." Mr. Davidson nodded. Dawn nodded along with him. "Okay, I'll need your driver's and registration then, and ask that you wait here patiently while I go back and print out your speeding ticket, then we can both get on with our night." "No, Mrs. Foley," he said, "I'm afraid we're not doing that." He had been so cooperative up until now. Had she misheard him? "Excuse me, sir?" "We're not going our separate ways and getting on with our separate nights." "And why is that, sir?" "Why don't you come around to the passenger side and get in? We'll talk about it." "You can tell me right now, sir. I'm listening." "A great man wants to meet you. I'd like to take you to him." He wasn't drunk. He wasn't under any kind of influence. He was clear-headed, but... "Mr. Davidson, you're coming awfully close to threatening an officer of the law, and it's all being recorded." "I'm not threatening you. I'm just telling you what's going to happen." This was snowballing. She had to stop it. "All right, Mr. Davidson, step out of the car." "No, you step into the car." Dawn began the motion of pulling the gun from her holster. "There's already a gun pointed at you, Mrs. Foley." Instincts told her the gun would be pointed at her back, but a moment later she knew. The mountains of blankets and bottles in the back seat had been a convincing cover. You weren't supposed to let criminals take you alive. You were supposed to move and fire. But if there was a gun already pointed at her, then that would just get her killed. If they wanted to kill her, she'd be dead already. "This is all being recorded," she said, hearing the desperation in her own words. "Sure it is," said Davidson, a man with no criminal history, who sped by an officer multiple times in hopes of being chased. A man who probably had no criminal history because he arranged for it to be that way. "This is your last chance, Mr. Davidson." "This is your last chance to stop us from heading over to 2232 Chestnut Street and giving your husband and son a wake-up call." A lot of emotions passed through her system when he said her address, but surprise wasn't one of them. This is one of the many fears that came with wearing the uniform. You work with people who are willing to kill, and you chase after people who are willing to kill. It's a fine line between the two, and you have to go into it knowing that cops and criminals will inevitably work together. With the radio silence and the driver's complete control over this unorthodox situation, Dawn had no doubt that this was an inside job. "That's right, Mrs. Foley. I can see the relent in your eyes. Go with it. Your hand is already on the gun. Just pull it out of that holster and throw it across the road into the ditch. But if the barrel so much as wavers at me in mid-swing, then Eagle Eye's in the back there, Don automatically glanced in the back, where a pair of hands and a revolver were lit by the high beams of her cruiser, but the rest of the shooter was still camouflaged. She'll take you down before your brain even sends a command to squeeze the trigger. We will laugh as you bleed, and then we'll go wake up the family. So what do you say, Mrs. Foley? Dale Scranton. Captain Scranton. He had to be the one who'd given her up. There had been stories of him within the department, of the shady ways his investigations had been resolved, of the criminals he'd taken in going on to escape the police station. Nothing like that had happened in Don's short time there, and whenever she questioned these occurrences, the answers would quickly die out. No one had any details, no one wanted any details. They wanted to gossip them beyond their way. Maybe because they didn't want to end up where Don was right now. You have a graphic way of speaking, Mr. Davidson. The bastard smiled. Hop in, we'll talk all about it. So she would live, at least for a while. She might learn why Scranton had chosen right before she died. She had to at least stay alive long enough to warn Adam, and that would involve her weakest skill, negotiating. Sleazy, slimy negotiating. There was just something about pretending to be the criminal's friend, to have their best interests in heart that Don never took to. Time to get over that. As carefully as possible, hardly believing that her muscles were even performing the functions, she threw her gun across the road and heard it splatter into the mud of the ditch. She felt like she had disrobed entirely. Good, said Mr. Davidson. Now the phone. What a terrible way to be taken. The abductors hadn't even left the comfort of their car. Amid everything else, Don was embarrassed. Then she realized that Captain Scranton would erase the recording and claim that the rookie forgot to turn it on. Routine traffic stops, it happens all the time, especially with inexperienced officers freshly returned from maternity leave. Oh, she would get them for this if it was her last step in life, she swore it. But first she had to get word back to Adam, which was going to be a challenge after throwing her phone into the ditch. And last but not least, that little utility belt. Really? Really. Unbuckle it. Toss it. Don disbelievingly did, and threw her last line of communication with the world into the ditch. Now then, Mrs. Foley, go around the front of the car and get in the passenger seat. Her legs had become wobbly as she did so, and it was only when she was in the passenger seat and the door was closed that Don heard the shooter rise from the mess in the back seat. This had all been so set up. People had actually gotten together, brainstormed, and decided that this was the best way to snatch Don Foley. And it worked. So what's this all about? Buckle up, Mrs. Foley, trying to get me a ticket? There was a snicker from behind. A female snicker. Don looked and saw the woman. She appeared to be about the same age as the driver, with a disheveled ponytail. And any further details were distracted by the unnaturally large and square sunglasses she wore. She was wearing sunglasses at night, and that had to be the biggest joke of all of this. That's right, said Mr. Davidson, having read her expression, and being eager to explain, apparently. She's blind, but don't let that fool you into bravery. Sight is only one of the 5 sentences, and I recommend you don't test the other 4. Fine, she said. He said, swear. What? Swear you won't test the other 4 senses. Fine, she said, and uttered the most deceiving lie of her life. I swear I won't test them. Thank you, Mrs. Foley, he said, and took off, but drove the speed limit. Speeding into town on multiple occasions had been to lure her in, of course. What would Captain Scranton have said had she let the Caprice go? Would he have called her out on it? Would he have said, why didn't you stop that car I'm not supposed to know about? Depending on how important she was to this whole scheme, they might have just tried again and again until they succeeded. The caprice hit a pothole and jarred her spine. The back cushion was still in her cruiser. This could be a long drive. She thought of Jason Tosh probably nice and snugly in his own bed right now. And then she said, "Now do I get to know what this is all about?" "It's all about everything, Mrs. Foley. The root of all evil and the purpose of good to stop it. Everything." "Let me guess, you're on the good side." He raised his eyebrows. "Pretty good, Mrs. Foley. How'd you know?" "Everyone thinks they're on the good side, no matter how bad they are." "Well, if you want to get into that, Mrs. Foley, then every decision that everyone has ever made has been selfish. The most selfless act of nobility was made in the interest of the doer to better their self in their own eyes. You think you're going through this to bravely save the lives of your family, but the truth is, your actions are despicably selfish." "Wow. And how so, Mr. Davidson?" "You're terrified of losing them. Terrified of dealing with the daily grief of struggling to rebuild your life and never knowing if you'll be able to. Took philosophy in college, did you?" "Yes, I did, but that's beside the point. It goes deeper. Because your decision to keep them alive is pure evil." "Pure evil?" "You're denying them a trip into heaven, denying their entrance into eternal paradise, to selfishly keep them here with you in a mediocre life." "They seem to like it. So do I." "It's nothing compared to the heaven you deny them. You're not really religious, are you? I mean, you're only using religion hypothetically to prove your point, right?" "So now, Mrs. Foley, you're dodging the fact that you make evil, selfish choices." "Well, Saint Kidnapper, God created the world, so what's so bad about wanting to keep my family with me in it?" "God created hell too, Mrs. Foley. Want to drag your family down there? Because that's where you're going. You know, if you're trying to convert me into something, you could have left a brochure in my mailbox. This whole fiasco was a bit unnecessary." He backhanded her on the mouth. Just a tap, to show he meant business, but from a man as strong as he was, it brought immediate swelling to her lips. She could feel it. And as the sting began to seep in, so too did her anger. "Violence," she said, and regretted the next words before they came out. "The last refuge of the idiot." "I suggest you take this seriously, Mrs. Foley." In the silence of choosing her next words carefully, there came a thud from the rear. Not from the blind woman in the back seat, whose name she didn't know, but from further back. "I am taking it seriously." The words slurred out. A swollen jaw was in the works. "I seriously think you don't get laid much." "Whoa, a concussion must have made that sound like something good to say." Here the blind woman in the back seat decided to chime in for the first time. "He's a fantastic lay. He'd knock your spine into place if he wanted to." Don studied them more closely, trying to make sense of what she just said. She noticed the wedding rings on both of their fingers. Husband and wife? "Really?" she said, "because it looks like he missed yours by about 2.5 feet, twice. Or I take it you like it in the eyes, even better than being able to see?" "Oh, what am I doing?" she thought. "That backhand must have been stronger than I thought. I'm losing control of myself." Surprisingly, the Davidsons were silent, though. They were steaming, but silent. It was the same boiling, defeated silence that came over drivers that she stopped when they realized that they weren't going to talk their way out of the speeding ticket, and that speeding hadn't gotten them to their destination in time after all. There were 2 more thuds from the rear, low and muffled. Mr. Davidson spoke over those sounds. "I'm beginning to understand why he was willing to give you up, Mrs. Foley. Look, I'm sorry, but you just smacked me in the face and then your wife insulted me. Have you ever been smacked in the face and insulted? It makes you mad." "Are you ready to take this seriously, Mrs. Foley?" "Yes, of course. One more cheeky remark." "I only got cheeky after the smack in the face. I'm sorry. Please continue." The thudding had become regular now, and it was joined by what sounded like moaning. Please, God, don't let it be moaning, she thought. Don interrupted him before he opened his mouth. I hope it's not cheeky to point this out, but I've noticed for a while that something's wrong with your car, I think. There's a funny noise coming from the tail end. Mr. Davidson listened. Oh, that's just Janice. You're lucky, Mrs. Davidson added. If the sedative had worn off sooner, you'd be dead already. Don was trying to make sense of all this, but she did get a visual of what Mrs. Davidson had said. Approach the car, hear the sounds from the trunk, draw her gun on the driver, and bleed to death never knowing why, perhaps. But those sounds from the back were becoming panicked now. Don wouldn't be able to keep a strong nerve for much longer. She said, I think Janice wants to get out. Maybe you should stop. The last word wavered, and Don covered her mouth with shaking fingers. The touch stung her lips and almost brought her to tears. This was becoming overwhelming. Mr. Davidson said, I think you're right, and I think you know what will happen if you move in the slightest. Don nodded. People who abducted for reasons other than money did it to dominate their victims. If they believed they were in control long enough, Don could take advantage of that. Mr. Davidson turned off the car and the lights. He turned on the hazard lights. Reaching under the seat, he popped the trunk and came up with a little black bag in his hand. The noises from the rear petered out, and his footsteps on the blacktop echoed in the silence. The sounds of the night became louder here and less relaxing. They brought images of all those creatures out there in the Mahantago Mountains feasting on each other. They reminded her that Mahantago was a Lenape word for good hunting grounds. Wrong, said Mrs. Davidson, as if responding to Don's thoughts. You're actually at a greater disadvantage while he's gone, because we're in the dark now and you'd regret trying anything. Don thought, thanks for keeping me on target. And then she said, again, I won't. I still don't know what your plans are for me. You'll know when we get there. Does the girl in the trunk play into your plans? Said Mrs. Davidson, who seemed to be reveling in this whole situation. I guess spouting laws and propositions to blackmail your crippled ass into the department doesn't take intelligence, just cheeky annoyance. That's right. Underestimate my wits and play into my plans, Don thought, and simply said, I guess. This was awfully confusing. On one hand, they seemed to want her to be on their side, but on the other hand, they were degrading her. The car shook as Mr. Davidson shut the trunk. It shook once more as he plopped into the driver's seat with a long look on his face. He returned the black bag to its place. Mrs. Davidson sensed the moping and her hand found his shoulder. Rubbing her hand, he said, Sorry, honey, it just breaks my heart. It's not our fault, hon. We tried to teach her right. True, he said, we tried. We're just those unlucky parents whose child went astray, through no fault of their own. Mrs. Davidson said, That's true. Mr. Davidson said, But we're making it right. Mrs. Davidson said, We are. They squeezed hands and parted, and Don was left with the feeling that this whole thing was just a play that was being performed for herself. Mr. Davidson started the car and waited for an 18-wheeler to pass and drove on. And that concludes Chapter 2 of Children of the Light by Michael Mastrella. Once again, if you want the full novel in its purest, best form, stay tuned for information on my Patreon page, which I hope will be up and in operation as soon as possible. And then you will get the best experience of reading the text and interpreting it with your own imagination, instead of having to put up with an amateur audio narrator's voice. I hope it wasn't too bad, and I hope the story was good enough that you were able to forget about the amateur narration. So, I will see you next time. Goodbye.